Good morning and an early Happy New Year from WKYT News. I'm Bill Bryant and we welcome you to Kentucky Newsmakers. Later, a conversation with a distinguished author, speaker, and professor who has counseled at-risk youth here in Kentucky and some of the toughest areas across America. Dr. Gilbert Singletary will be here with us shortly. But first, Kentucky House Majority Leader Jonathan Schell is here with us. Schell counts the votes and helps set the direction in the Republican-dominated Kentucky House. We have a chance to talk to him just days before members of the General Assembly report to Frankfort and begin what many believe will be a very tough session. Lawmakers will try again to deal with the deep public pension debt that hangs around the neck of state government. And then there's the tough task of putting together a two-year budget. While the national economy has picked up, Kentucky's revenue code doesn't capture enough money to fund even the current budget, and many say there will be deep cuts in the coming spending plan. With that as a backdrop, Majority Leader Schell is joining us this morning. Thanks for coming. We appreciate it.
Good morning. Thank you.
Well, first things first, the House Speaker Jeff Hoover resigned in November after acknowledging that he had signed a sexual harassment settlement with a staffer. His resignation apparently is not official when the House is out of session. When you go back in on Tuesday, does he return as Speaker, or what do you expect in that regard?
As we operate right now going into session, we're operating under our current situation, which is we have an acting Speaker in Pro Tem David Osborne, and that's how we're moving forward whenever we come in on January the 2nd. And we look forward to getting back to the people's business and actually getting into this section and hopefully without as few distractions as possible so that we can really get into what we're here to talk about today, which is on the budget and pensions and the rest of the issues.
So you do not anticipate a Speaker vote next week? Then?
I don't anticipate one, but you know we're operating right now under our current situation, which is acting Speaker Pro Tem David Osborne.
How much of a distraction has all of this been?
You know, it's unfortunate, as it is nationally, but you know, this is a conversation that needed to be had in certain areas. I think that it's gotten out of control in others, but I think that, you know, as much of a distraction as it is, we have still continued to do the work in the House of Representatives, whether it be on our adoption and foster care work group or infrastructure work group, or getting ready for this mammoth of a budget that we're getting ready to go into.
The issues are tough. The pension problem did not get addressed in a special session as the governor had wanted to do. Now he's urging the legislature to get right on the pensions as soon as you start to meet. Everybody knowing that filing deadline is coming up on January 30th, and traditionally things have been slow before that. The governor earlier had said there would be mayhem if all of this came together at the same time, trying to deal with pensions and the budget. Can you make sense of it all?
Well, it's going to be difficult, but that's our jobs. You know, that's what we were elected by the people of this state to do, is to come into this session, to come in any session that we're duly elected to go into, and actually perform our job. And that's what we're prepared to do. That's what we've been preparing. That's what we've been preparing to do all year. And whenever we come in on January the 2nd, we're going to be ready in order to do the people's business. And whether it was in a special session or whether it's in this regular session, we have to tackle this issue with pension reform. And you know, we have been pretty proud of the fact that our members in the House Republican majority are not worried about their re-elections whenever it comes to the issues that we have to face in this state. Our members have taken some what most would consider to be very tough votes in the past year. And whenever you ask some of our even freshman members, whenever they talk about these tough votes, they say it wasn't a tough vote, it was the right vote. And that's what we're looking at doing whenever we come into this session.
As you get rolling, you think that they will be prepared to get right on pensions day one?
Well, yes and no. Yes, we are prepared to get on with pensions on day one, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we're making the right vote. And so we're still gathering the information, we're still getting actuarial analysis on different types of bills, different types of proposals, and we hope to do that whenever we first come into session, but we're going to make sure that we're making the right vote.
We understand that there is a bill out there that addresses some of the concerns that some of the teachers and other state workers had raised. Does that exist? Is it ready to be released to the public?
There are multiple bills that are out there, and we are still waiting on getting actuarial analysis back on a couple of different provisions. And whenever we do get to a point to where that we can put that out publicly and actually show what the numbers look like, we plan on doing so. But what we don't want to happen is to put something out there and then, you know, have people put speculation on what exactly that it will do, won't do, and have our members putting out speculation on what things will do and won't do. And so what we've tried to do is take a responsible approach this second round of bills that have been scored actuarially, and hopefully have our numbers ready before we actually put it out publicly. And we have no problem with doing that. We're just waiting on getting back some final numbers.
You were not in session when the last bill was proposed, and yet the pushback was very tough across the state. This time you will be in session with that time clock ticking and with the pressure of getting some other things done. Will that make it more difficult to once the public sees the bill and people start to assess the fallout?
You know, we'll see. What we've been doing is we've been listening to our constituents across the state. We've been looking at the actual problem that we face, and the pension issue is not just one-sided. It's not just based on benefits and just based on public employees and cuts or anything that may happen to the actual benefit structure. What we're looking at doing is putting an additional $1 billion into this system through the funding of it, and that's something that's been lost through this entire conversation, is that not only are we looking at how do we structurally reform the system, but we're also making sure and making a commitment to the people of the state and to the people that actually get these pensions that we're going to put in $1 billion in new money into these to get them shored up. And that's important for two reasons. We have to look at this from a credit rating also. And when you look at it from that aspect, that doesn't just affect the credit rating of the state. That affects the credit rating of everyone that has a mortgage, that does business in the state. And so it's extremely important for us to get our fiscal house in order on the pension issues so that our credit rating doesn't continue to downgrade. There's a lot of banks across the state that actually have in holdings the debt of some of these school districts. And those things are not lost on us in Frankfort. And if it was just a one-sided flip of the coin, you know, there's a lot of decisions that we would make. But what I have found in Frankfort is there are many sides to the coins that we have to deal with. And this is one of those that have many sides to it.
Do you believe, Leader Schell, that this has to be done before the budget can be, the budget matter can be settled?
It is extremely important for it to be, because we have to figure out what the exact appropriation is going to be for this next budget, so that then we can write a budget based on that. We are already $138 million short in fiscal year 2017, and it looks like the same thing in fiscal year 18. And as we go into building the budget for 19 and 20, we have to know down to the pennies how much we're going to have in that state budget so that we can ensure that we're providing the state services that are required, but also making sure that state government is living within inside of its means.
How difficult will it be to write that budget, and how concerned are you that the national economy seems to really be taking off, and many states are progressing, going along, and Kentucky's revenue code is not capturing adequate money to keep our programs afloat?
Well, I think what we're going to see is a continual increase in our state revenues that are coming in. What you've seen nationally is on the state economies that are based on consumptions, which are what our new economies in great states that are really doing a good job economically are based on. They've had a lag in that because of once the recovery that came back, what I've seen is that people are starting to pay down their debt now that they have extra money instead of going out and spending a lot of money on new things that would be considered to be consumption. And so what we have in this state is the same dynamic, but we also have some huge economic drivers that have happened this year with the announcement of Toyota, Amazon, Brady Industries, and others. We're nearing $9 billion in new investment. And those investments are not immediate. That's not an immediate that's going to happen right now. But over the next 2 to 5 years, we're going to see a pretty big increase in what we're going to actually have as economic growth and economic development, not only for the people of this state and job growth, but also for the coffers of the state.
How profound do you think the cuts will have to be to put forth a balanced budget that the state constitution requires?
You know, we don't have those exact numbers yet. We're waiting to see what the governor's budget is going to look like before we start looking at our budget. That's the process. The governor, I think, has to propose his by the 10th legislative day. I know the budget director has been meeting with his cabinets, talking about what their budgets are going to look like and exactly what their needs are going to be based on. I expect there to be cuts. We have been able to hold harmless Medicaid. We've been able to hold harmless our SEEK formula in education, and we've been able to hold harmless our corrections industry in the past budgets, even though we've had cuts in other areas. If we don't get a hold on the massive debt that we have in the pension system and start looking towards some kind of tax reform in the future, we're going to have to make deep cuts in those as well.
We're with the Majority Floor Leader in the Kentucky House, Jonathan Schell, and Kentucky Newsmakers. We'll be back with him in just a moment, and we hope you'll stay with us in just a little bit. You're going to meet a speaker with a national profile. We're looking forward to that as well, here on WKYT's Kentucky Newsmakers. We welcome you back to WKYT's Kentucky Newsmakers. We are interviewing today the majority floor leader, the head of the Republicans in the House over at the state legislature in Frankfort, and they get back to work on Tuesday. And otherwise, Mr. Shell, you're a farmer and so forth, so it takes a lot of your time, doesn't it, to do these duties? I can only imagine.
I'd like to be a farmer more than I have been lately, but yes, that's what I do for a living.
You mentioned trying to balance this budget, that there will be cuts. You said that there have been some areas that have been held harmless. Can those areas be held harmless again, specifically education?
Well, we're going to try our best to do so. What I have found in education is that when you start making cuts outside of the SEEK formula and even inside the SEEK formula, it's not necessarily the students that are doing good right now. It's not necessarily the students that are your A students that are performing at the right levels that are going to be affected. The kids that are going to be affected are kids like mine. I have a son who's 6 years old and in the first grade who's in reading recovery, which is a great program across the state that allows for students that are behind to be able to get caught back up. And those are the programs, along with the Friskies programs, which is the Family Resource Centers and other programs like that, that really get low performing students and at-risk students back up to par so that our scores and so that our students and our society in general is going to be brought up. And that's what my fear is in this next session, and what I'm going to be fighting for the most is to make sure that we're making cuts in areas that are necessary, that we keep government in its confines, but we also don't go too deep into our education budget and other budgets to where that we make sure that we're performing at the right level in our education system.
Talk just a moment about higher education. You know, Kentucky's a bit of an outlier in that many states have gone back to funding at full levels their higher education. We've been cutting for nearly a decade at this point. We know people with degrees make more money and pay more taxes. Can those colleges and universities be looking at cuts again?
Well, they also have a pension debt and a pension obligation that they have to take care of, just similar to what our local municipalities do, and their pension obligation is going to increase as well. As we need to address this situation and put more money in the pension system from a state perspective, we also have to do so from our higher education and from our local municipalities. And I foresee us working very diligently to try and keep that from happening for higher education, just for the reasons that you stated. But at the same time, the realities in the budget that we have is that we're going to have to make cuts in order to keep state government in its confines.
We have this horrid opioid crisis in Kentucky, and despite our efforts, it shows very few signs of slowing down at this point, and it's driving back up the prison population. So, you know, you're about as likely to be in prison in Kentucky as anywhere in the world. How does the legislature look at getting at that?
Well, I mean, we're in a sad day and time right now in our drug epidemic, especially with the opioid crisis. In the last 10 years, we have lost about 10% of our working age males in this state, or in this country, in the workforce participation. And that is a very sad thing when you talk about the jobs and the need for what we've talked about here. All the needs that state government has and federally that we have. That is a continuing crisis that we're going to face, especially with the drug epidemic. Something that many people don't realize and know is that the jail population is extremely lopsided right now towards females, and that is being extremely hurtful all across this state, with women that are getting incarcerated that are pregnant or with young children, and it's putting an increase in burden on the foster care system and on the state just for that reason too. And so the opioid crisis is one that is a financial crisis, it's a family crisis, and it's an individual crisis. And we've tried to address those things in the past in the legislature with House Bill 333, which limited the amount of pain prescriptions that a doctor can prescribe 3 days. And we're hoping to limit the opioid access in medicine cabinets across the state. We have to start looking at treatment again. And Madison County, as you know, has got a pretty good program that they're trying to implement as a pilot program that they're actually, I think, getting some funding from a federal, the CARA Act that came down from Senator McConnell in the U.S. Senate, getting some money from that to try and help out. And you know, what we're trying to do is look at it holistically on the actual problem that we face, whether it be from the incarceration, the family aspect, and the individual for treatment.
We had 140,000 children apparently in Kentucky who were without one of their parents who was incarcerated over the Christmas holidays. That was one of the stats I saw. Difficult situation. Infrastructure. You said we have some large needs in Kentucky, and getting at that is going to be a challenge.
Yeah. So in 2014, our annual road budget was about $886 million. And over the last couple of years to 2017, it has gone down to about $760 million, which is about a $126 million loss in the road fund aid that we actually have, which is due to the gas tax decrease and certain other things with electric hybrids and those kind of things that we're not taxing exactly the right way and getting the revenues from. And so when you look at the actual need in the state for infrastructure, we're about $1 billion behind just in resurfacing. And I know your viewers are feeling that on the roads as well. But we're also about $1 billion back annually on repairs of bridges, new construction of bridges, and new construction of roads. And so we have a lot of need in this state, and we have a lot of need in the infrastructure of this state. And my philosophy, the way that I look at state government, the way that I look at government, is there's two things that are going to help you grow economically to be able to get the more money in for these things, and it's education and infrastructure. And those are two places that we've talked about this morning that we're going to have to look at making cuts if we don't do something about that. And so what we're going to try and do in this next session is focus on those two areas and others, along with the drug epidemic and the pensions, and really try to put our handle on that to try and turn this state around educationally, to try and turn this state around with our infrastructure so that we can get even more economic growth, even though we've had a record year this year in economic growth.
Majority Leader Shell, thanks for coming. We really appreciate it very much. And stay with us on Kentucky Newsmakers. As we head into a new year, a man who wrote a book called Crossroads, Dr. Gilbert Singletary, is with us next on WKYT. Welcome back to Kentucky Newsmakers. The more research I did about our next guest, the more intriguing I found him to be. Dr. Gilbert Singletary grew up in poverty, the son of sharecroppers. He became an athlete and the first of 7 kids to graduate from college. Now he holds a PhD, a law degree, and an MBA, and he speaks around the country on overcoming the odds. He also calls Lexington home when he's not challenging young people of all races and backgrounds to choose the right path over the wrong one when they face a crossroads, the title of his series of books. And Dr. Singletary, thank you very much for coming in. We appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me, Bill.
Good to see you.
Likewise.
Let's get a little bit more about your background. You actually grew up in the projects. You now head one of the largest mental health community agencies in Kentucky. You're invited to speak around the country. How did you get from there to here?
That journey started in Florida, in a little small place called Pahokee. I like to combine the two together, Pahokee and Belglade, consisting of the Glades. That sort of pilgrimage led me here to Kentucky, a football team here in Kentucky back in the late 1990s. And from there, graduate school, PhD, as you mentioned, law degree, etc. So that sort of business sort of brought me here in Kentucky.
And so your book is Crossroads. You faced crossroads in your life. You talked to young people about the crossroads they face. And you told me this country is facing a crossroads right now.
Absolutely. I think right now our country is in the midst of a crossroads where the social fabrics of our country are sort of being tested, if you will. One of the things that strikes me is you hear the cliche that when America sneezes, the world catches a cold. And I always say, well, if the world catches a cold, what happens in sort of black and brown communities? And my answer to that is they catch cancer, because there are so many different issues that are going on that they're facing in the black and brown communities. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to take my experiences to those communities and talk about how do we overcome some of those crossroads that they experience in those communities.
Some are far more equipped than others to make good decisions, but you make the case that everybody can be empowered to choose the right path.
Correct. I think everyone can be empowered to choose the right path if in fact they're given the resources to make those right decisions. And I think in large parts, the resources are not there, particularly in the black and brown communities, of being able to seek mental health counseling, being able to have access to education, access to federal, state loans. I think those are some of the things that sort of separates those who are successful from those who are not successful.
This opioid issue, and I discussed it with the majority leader just before you came here, is so crippling to Kentucky financially, and certainly is ruining families, and is a very difficult issue. And I know you told me that it had touched you personally here in the last little bit.
It did. Christmas Day, I received probably the worst phone call that I could ever receive, that a brother and been a good friend of over 20 years passed away Christmas of an overdose. And it sort of brought back to me thoughts of how just the impact of the opioid epidemic. And it's something that does not have to happen, Bill. We've talked about this before. I mentioned to you that this is not something new for our country. In the 1970s, President Harold Ford summons a task force to assess the drug epidemic at that time. Very clear statements coming out in terms of recommendations that drugs were slowly starting to become a major issue in our country. 1980s, the New England Journal of Medicine released a document that says that drugs are not a problem. For those who don't have a history of drugs in our country, they're very less likely to become addicted to drugs. And so it pains me when we think about what's happening in our black and brown communities, and when we think about this sort of systemic effect that's taking place here. And I don't think there's sort of a lack of causation here, Bill, in terms of what we're seeing at the national level and what we're seeing taking place in our communities. I think if you think about the two biggest issues in the communities, it's guns, which I talk about that in Chicago, I talk about it in Baltimore, I talk about it in Lexington, and it's substance abuse. And there's no lack of connection in terms of Big Pharma, the drug companies, one of the largest lobbying entities in the U.S., the NRA, one of the largest entities in terms of lobbying in the U.S., and how that affects what we're seeing here in our black and brown communities across the United States. It pains me that we're not doing enough in those areas to address some of these problems.
How do you empower young people to make better decisions when there's a glimmer of hope? And you've told me, I mean, you have worked on the streets in Chicago and some of the toughest neighborhoods in America. And when you see that glimmer of hope, as far as a young person who could take one path or the other,
sure,
how do you nudge them to take the right one?
It's connecting those individuals that have a glimmer of hope to other sources that are powerful, and so that they can sort of lead them in that right direction or down that right path. I think that's what's missing is leadership. And if we could somehow connect those individuals who are lacking, or who have rather, that insight that there is a better life, and that's what I had. I didn't really realize that I had that within me, but I always knew that something was better than what I was experiencing in my beloved town. I always knew that there was something bigger, that there was something better there, but I think what we have is a dearth of leadership and positive role models in these communities. My father always said to me that one lion leading 100 sheep could defeat 1,000 lions led by one sheep. And I think that's a function of leadership, and that's a function of having positive mentors in your life. And that's something that in the black and brown communities and some of our communities at large, that's missing. It's role models, it's leadership. And so to take that one individual that has that glimmer of hope and connecting him or her with some other greater resources, I think that's sort of the key, in addition to getting help and counseling as well.
There's much division in the country, and you were talking of the protests that have gone on at the NFL football games.
Yes.
Certainly are something that you have been asked about and you've
Sure.
spoken on across the country.
Sure. Yeah, I think that it's important for us to realize that I don't take a position necessarily on the protest, whether it's something right or whether it's something wrong. As sort of a legal scholar, I support the process of protesting, and I think many of our soldiers would agree. I think what is missing is that it's the process with which these gentlemen are choosing to, this platform that they're choosing to demonstrate their rights or evidence their rights. I think it's important to realize that our country, this is a part of the fabric of our country. Rosa Parks' protest on the bus was not about saying, I don't want to ride the bus, or the bus system is terrible. It was about a larger platform going back to 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, fast forwarding into 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, separate but equal. That was sort of the underlying cause. Gandhi wasn't protesting food. The Bostonians weren't protesting tea. It was a sort of overarching larger cause, and I think that's what I'm most proud of in terms of this movement, because it's shining light on those issues that we talked about, police brutality, substance abuse, all of those issues that are germane in the black and brown communities. That's what the protest is about. I don't necessarily get involved in taking a position, but I'm more concerned about what's taking place in my hometown, Pahokee, Belglade, my community, Lexington, Chicago, Baltimore, Oakland. I'm concerned about what's going on there.
Can personal responsibility be taught and instilled, that no one writes your personal story but you?
That's a really good question, Bill. And personal responsibility certainly can be taught. But one of the things that happens, and I'll mention this real briefly, in the black and brown communities, is these men and women are bombarded with trauma. And trauma changes our brain and how our brain functions and how our brain perceives the world, how our brain perceives threats, real and perceived threats. When someone experiences trauma, the body doesn't distinguish between real and perceived trauma. If someone ran in this building right now and said, there is a Jeep, I think you drive a Jeep, right, Bill?
I did.
Yeah. If someone said, there's a Jeep on fire outside, well, I drive a Lexus. Someone said, there's a Jeep outside, it's on fire, I wouldn't budge because I don't drive a Jeep. But you would. And they didn't say it's Bill's Jeep. They said there's a Jeep outside. So what the body perceives, what the mind perceives, the body believes. Your heart will start racing, and you're ready to get out of here.
The book is Crossroads, an American case study. Choose your path. And Dr. Singletary, we really appreciate you coming by. Folks can check that out on Amazon.
Yes.
Right? Thank you. And thank you for joining us for this edition of Kentucky Newsmakers. Happy New Year, and we hope you make it a good week ahead.